Well, after a 1 minute break to have a drink for my iced tea, we are back for the next lecture here in Chapter 8 on contracts. And so the first question that we want to ask is, should all promises be enforced? If somebody says they're going to do something, do you always hold them to it? Okay. And what the law says is that promises that are not offered in exchange for something of value will typically not be viewed as a binding contract. Okay. So if I said to the class, okay, at the end of the semester, I'm going to throw a pizza party, assuming we're all able to congregate at that time, and I never do, you can't go after me and say Fractor promised a pizza party and didn't deliver. Shame on him, and we're going to sue him, or file a grievance or something of that nature. No, you didn't provide anything in return, so that's not going to be a contract. It's a promise, but it's not an enforceable promise. Okay, and the book has some really good examples in Chapter 8 of promises that are not going to be kept or should not be enforced. So I don't need to go through that. You can read it. I don't need to kind of reinvent the wheel. Some of these are confused promises where you think you're buying one thing, but you're really buying something else, and you didn't think you were buying that something else. And therefore, usually in a situation like that, you're going to get a refund. Okay. I had a situation that happened like that when I was in junior high school, and someone in my class said, "Oh, I've got a Nikon camera for sale, and like it's really cheap if you're interested." And my brother happens to be really into photography, so I told him about it. We drove over to the kid's house and found out that the camera was not a Nikon; it was a Nico, Nicoh, which was not at the level of a Nikon camera. And so, of course, at that point, my brother didn't want the camera at all. Now, we hadn't promised anything, but it was certainly a confused promise in that particular case. So in a situation like that, no harm, no foul, get your money back. Misunderstanding between the parties. Okay. Another kind of promise could be a deceptive promise, where you promise something and it may literally do the trick, but it was not what was contemplated by the other party when they agreed to it. So I think the example in the book refers to somebody placing an ad for a surefire way to kill crickets. And the surefire way to kill crickets was, here's two bricks, put the cricket between the two bricks and you've killed the cricket. Well, we all know that is a way to do that, but that was not what was contemplated. Okay, clearly deceptive in a situation like that. A refund at a minimum, and maybe some sort of penalty for those who are trying to provide something that's not. That's different than out-and-out fraud, where you've got some people online who are selling coronavirus test kits that are nothing of the sort, okay? And that's simply a fraudulent act, and clearly we've got laws against that, okay? So if a promise is part of a bargain to trade one thing for another, and it could be a relatively minor thing, but it's got to be something of value, then it is going to be enforceable. Now, when we talk about contracts, we bring in bargaining theory. We bring in bargaining theory a little bit differently than we did before, when we're looking at threat value and we're looking at cooperative surplus, and then what the optimal thing to do, the optimal compromise and things of that nature. Here we're looking at slightly different. A contract will have three elements. So too will a tort later on, but we'll worry about the later on. There are three elements to a contract. There's an offer, an acceptance, and consideration. So somebody promises to do something, someone agrees to have that thing done, and then offers something in return to induce the thing that was offered, okay? And when we are talking about contracts, we bring into play a couple of new terms. One is the promisor, Promisor. That is the one who gives the promise, okay? And the promisee is the person to whom the promise is made, okay? So for example, when I have a potential new client who calls me about a case, I'm the promisor as the consultant. The client, the attorney, is the promisee. They're the ones to whom I have made a promise that for consideration, I will offer certain kinds of services to them, okay? The consideration is to receive the retainer, let's say, for our services, which then makes the contract enforceable, okay? So the promisor, me in that case, makes the promise, the promisee accepts the promise, and then to the promisor provides the necessary consideration to allow that to take place, okay? Now, a big issue that comes up with contracts, and you might think as you're reading through about contracts, everything is geared towards what happens if someone breaks the contract. And the idea is actually to get people to fulfill the contracts, but to give them the necessary nudge to get them, to encourage them to fulfill the contract, you need to have significant consequences if they in some sort of opportunistic way, try to avoid fulfilling the contract. So a lot of what we talk about in Chapter 8 and then the stuff that we're going to be doing in Chapter 9, which I haven't assigned yet, and it's really just going to be dealing with different damage theories and the like. But if a bargain is in fact breach, and the operative term here is going to be breach of contract, we talk about that over and over and over again. So if one of the parties breaches the contract, what should the remedy be? Okay. And a good starting point for that would be the benefit of the bargain. If the contract had followed through, what in fact would the two parties have gained from that? And that's what they're entitled to. And another way of looking at that would be the expectation damages. If it's a $100,000 contract, and it's breached, the party who was the promisor there let's say they were provided with the promise of receiving $100,000 in business from the promisee, and somehow that contract was breached. Are they entitled to the profits associated with that? I mean, you were hiring me to build a new office for you, and it was going to cost $100,000, and then you stopped making payments, and I was never able to complete the deal. Am I in line to sue you for $100,000? The answer is no. The answer is, what would the likely profits have been? So what we need to look at in a situation like that would be, bring back Econ 160 to the mix, variable costs associated with the projects, maybe certain kinds of fixed costs that were expended, but variable costs, and particularly the variable costs that were saved. So if I was going to build an office for you and you're going to pay me $100,000 and it never went through, but I have a legal means to go after you because you breached it, I did save on hiring labor that would have been used to help build it. I saved on materials that I would have had to purchase to help build the office. I don't have to make those expenditures now. So it's the profits associated with the business. It's not the gross amount. So when I get a client that calls me and says, oh, my client got hurt and they had this business and they were billing $150,000 a year, and so therefore their loss is $150,000 a year. No way is it $150,000 a year. It's only a question of, okay, how much would have contributed to their bottom line out of the $150,000? Could be something a lot less than that. Okay. Now, let's start talking about, from an economist standpoint, an economic theory of contracts. So we've got the bargain down. offer, acceptance, consideration, remember those terms. And of course, now you're going to have an online exam anyway, so you're going to more easily be able to remember those terms. From the perspective of economists looking at contract law, of course, the goal is to allow parties to make themselves better off. Okay? So, simple example where you don't need a contract even though you have an exchange. Farmer's market. You go to the farmer's market, you could look at the produce and you can feel it and see, does it feel ripe? Does it feel rotten? Does it look right? Does it look like the pear's turning brown or something like that? It's pretty much a simultaneous exchange. It's not perfect because sometimes you'll bring the item home and it really doesn't taste good. It's not fully in season or whatever, but it's such a small expenditure. The value of the contract is so low, we don't really worry about that, okay? We do worry about the contracts that don't have simultaneous exchange. They're the ones that would involve what we would call a deferred exchange, and that is where a promise is made for payment later or vice versa, okay? And there's obvious risks if a party doesn't follow through, and with deferred exchange, enforceability is a key thing. I'm going to give you a personal story because I was naive about it and suffered the consequences and had to go through a lot of legal hoops to kind of deal with the issue. And that is, we were living in Porter Ranch at the time of the 1994 earthquake, and our house was not red tagged, but we suffered more than $50,000 worth of damage. We had to move out. My wife was pregnant with our second one. It was a difficult situation. Our daughter was young. And we hired a contractor to go and make repairs to the house. Okay? And along the way, I would make progress payments. Okay? And the house was finished. And I had one progress payment left to make and said, okay, I need you to spend another $5,000, to complete the contract. And I wrote him a check and just gave it to him without doing an inspection to make sure that everything was in the up and up. And everything was not in the up and up, okay? They had done certain things in the repair flat out incorrectly, okay? And of course, at that point, the contract was fulfilled to them. So to talk to them, get them to respond, and to fix the things that they had done wrong led to absolutely no response. And so I ended up having to sue them. And it was not pretty. It was a pain in the neck. I got some payment at the end of the day, but it was a tremendous hassle and not worth the effort. And if I had been a little more focused, obviously my life was being pulled in a lot of directions at the time, I would have probably said, well, let's do a walkthrough and make sure everything is on the up and up and repaired to the level that we expected it to be repaired, and the contract stated that it would be repaired, and then you will get your final payment. Okay, so enforceability, not a bad thing because it reduces uncertainty. It will promote efficiency because both parties know their feet will be held to the fire. Okay, so we will pick up on this, and in the next lecture or the next sliver of a lecture, we will use some game theory back from chapter 2 to kind of analyze this. And a lot of what we're going to look at now is going to be things like breach, the likelihood of breach, why it makes sense sometimes to breach contracts. You would think the whole idea about contract law is to get people to follow through, but you know what? It could be economically efficient to tear the contract up and let one party compensate the other for whatever had not been fulfilled in the contract. We'll explain that as we go along in chapter 8, and we'll see you soon.